I sat at the narrow table in the courtroom with my hands folded neatly in front of me, aware of every breath, every sound, every expectation pressing down on my silence. The hearing hadn't officially begun yet, but the outcome had already been decided in their minds. I could feel it in the way my husband leaned back in his chair, relaxed, almost bored. I could see it in the way his mistress sat beside him, her posture confident, her mouth curved into a small, knowing smile. He leaned toward her and whispered something he clearly didn't think I would hear. "She has no chance." She smiled wider, slow and satisfied, like someone already planning what to do with the life they were about to inherit. Behind them, his sister crossed her arms and looked straight through me, her expression flat, dismissive. Not angry, not even curious, certain. This wasn't just my husband against me. This was a family that had already agreed on the ending. They waited. They waited for tears, for trembling, for me to crack under the weight of what they thought was inevitable. They waited for me to speak, to defend myself, to explain. I did none of it. I stayed silent, my face calm, my eyes steady. My silence only seemed to reassure them. Silence, to them, meant surrender. Then the judge opened the file. He didn't speak. He didn't react. He simply read, page by page, his expression unreadable. The room slowly grew still, the quiet stretching longer than it should have. I watched his eyes move across the paper and thought, not for the first time that morning, how little they understood what this moment really was. I wasn't here to beg. I wasn't here to argue. I was here to wait. Because when the judge finally spoke, everything they believed would begin to unravel. The hearing itself was only one line on the calendar, but it carried more weight than any date I could remember. Officially, it was a preliminary matter, a procedural step meant to address temporary authority and control while larger decisions loomed ahead. Unofficially, it was everything. If I lost here, I wouldn't just lose leverage. I would lose the ability to be heard at all. From the outside, it must have looked obvious how this would end. I sat alone at my table, no family flanking me, no reassuring touches on my arm. Across the aisle, my husband's side filled the row behind him, a quiet show of unity. They looked prepared, confident, already victorious. What no one could see was how long I had been preparing for this moment. As the judge continued reading in silence, I felt the familiar pull of memory, not a spiral into panic, but a controlled step backward. It always began the same way, when things slowed enough for the truth to surface. I thought of how none of this started with a courtroom. None of it started with a mistress. It didn't even start with betrayal. It started years earlier, when I believed that love and loyalty were enough to protect me. I remembered thinking back then that power announced itself loudly, that it came with raised voices, slammed doors, and obvious threats. I didn't understand yet that real power prefers quiet. It prefers patience. It prefers people who mistake calm for weakness. The judge paused briefly on one page, just long enough to be noticeable. My husband shifted in his seat, the first crack in his relaxed posture. His mistress glanced at him, confusion flickering across her face before she masked it again. His sister leaned forward, suddenly attentive. I kept my eyes on the judge. If anyone had asked me how I felt in that moment, I wouldn't have said brave, I wouldn't have said confident. I felt precise. Every choice I had made, every moment of restraint, every decision to stay silent instead of reacting had led here. This wasn't the first time I had been underestimated. It was just the first time it happened under fluorescent lights, with a court reporter recording every word and a judge holding the authority they had always assumed belonged to them. The room was filled with the soft sounds of paper, the faint creak of chairs, the controlled breathing of people who believed the story was already written. I knew better. As the judge turned another page, I realized how far back this story really went. Before the family gatherings where I was slowly pushed out of conversations. Before the decisions made without my knowledge. before the other woman stepped into a space that had already been cleared for her, long before the hearing. This was the end of a process that had begun the moment I entered a family that valued control over connection and loyalty over truth. The judge closed the file, not yet speaking, and adjusted his glasses. The air in the room changed, subtle but undeniable. For the first time that morning, no one smiled. And as I sat there, calm and silent, I thought about the woman I had been at the beginning of all this. The woman who believed belonging meant safety. The woman who thought being agreeable was the same as being secure. That woman had no chance. But I wasn't her anymore. While the judge continued reading in silence, my mind drifted backward to a time when none of this existed yet. Back to a version of my life that felt uncomplicated, steady, and full of promise. If someone had told me then that I would one day sit alone in a courtroom, watching an entire family align against me, I would have smiled politely and dismissed the idea. I believed too strongly in what I thought we were building. I met Daniel at a regional conference in Denver, one of those professional events filled with polite networking and lukewarm coffee. I had gone alone, focused on expanding my consulting work, not looking for anything personal. He stood out not because he was loud or charming, but because he listened. When I spoke, he didn't interrupt. He remembered details. He asked thoughtful questions that made me feel like my answers mattered. We talked for hours that afternoon, long past the point when we should have returned to the conference floor. He told me about his work, about his family, about how close they all were. He described them as traditional, loyal, protective of one another. At the time, that sounded comforting. I came from a small family myself, and the idea of belonging to something larger felt grounding. Our relationship grew easily. There was no drama, no chaos, no whirlwind intensity. Daniel made everything feel stable. He spoke often about the future, about building something solid, something lasting. When he talked about commitment, it didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a shared goal. The first time I met his family was at a holiday gathering in his hometown. They welcomed me warmly, or at least convincingly. His mother hugged me and told me how happy she was that Daniel had found someone so grounded. His sister smiled, assessed me quickly, and asked questions about my background that felt more like an interview than curiosity. I didn't mind. I assumed it was nerves. Families can be protective, I told myself. That evening I noticed how decisions were made around that table. Who spoke first? Who nodded in agreement? Who waited to see how others reacted before offering an opinion? Daniel's father rarely raised his voice, but when he did speak, the room adjusted around him. I filed it away as family dynamics. Nothing more. As the months passed, I found myself slipping naturally into their rhythm. I adjusted plans to accommodate family events. I listened more than I spoke. When small comments landed awkwardly, I laughed them off. Being adaptable felt like kindness. Being patient felt like maturity. Daniel noticed and he praised me for it. He told me his family admired how easygoing I was, how supportive. They liked that I didn't challenge him publicly, that I let him lead. At the time, those compliments felt like affirmation. I didn't realize they were instructions. The shift was subtle. Daniel began making decisions more quickly, with less discussion. Not because he was controlling, but because he was busy or stressed or trying to keep things moving. I understood. I was capable, independent, but I didn't need to be in charge of everything. Partnerships involved compromise. That's what I believed. His family reinforced it. They praised me for being flexible, for not making things complicated. His mother once told me, smiling, that Daniel needed peace at home if he was going to succeed. I took that as wisdom, not warning. When Daniel proposed, it felt inevitable in the best way. He spoke about loyalty, about standing together, about building a future that honored family and tradition. He said we would be a team, that we would protect each other no matter what. I felt chosen. I felt safe. What I didn't understand then was how carefully those words were chosen, how often loyalty was emphasized, and how rarely autonomy was mentioned. How being part of the family came with expectations that weren't written down, but enforced all the same. After we married, I noticed how easily my life folded into his. It didn't feel like erasure, it felt like efficiency. His schedule dictated our plans, his priorities shaped our decisions. When his family needed something, we rearranged. When I needed space, I postponed. Everyone told me how lucky Daniel was to have someone so understanding. I wore that label proudly. Understanding meant loving. Understanding meant strong. Or so I thought. There was a moment early on that I remember clearly now. We were at a family dinner, and a decision was made about something that affected both of us. Daniel spoke for us without looking in my direction. I hesitated, just briefly, but said nothing. His sister glanced at me, then smiled and said, "See? You two are perfectly aligned." That word stayed with me. Aligned. I believed alignment meant partnership. I didn't realize it meant compliance. As I sat in that courtroom years later, waiting for a judge to speak, I understood how easily I had stepped into a role I didn't choose consciously. I had mistaken acceptance for protection, agreement for security. I had believed that love would shield me from imbalance. It wouldn't be the affair that cost me my place. It wouldn't be the hearing itself. It would be the decision I made next, the one I entered willingly, believing it would strengthen my marriage, never imagining it would become the foundation they later used to remove me. At the time, my life felt balanced in a way I was proud of. My consulting work was steady, my reputation solid, and for the first time in years I felt like I had real momentum. Daniel and I talked about the future often, not in grand speeches but in practical plans. We were comfortable, stable. That was when he came to me with what he framed as a temporary problem. His company was entering what he called a critical phase. There was an opportunity, he said, one that required focus and flexibility. He explained it calmly, logically, as if he had rehearsed the conversation many times before bringing it to me. If things went well, it would benefit both of us. If they didn't, it would only be for a short while. "I just need to know we're on the same team," he said one evening, his voice low and sincere. "This only works if we trust each other completely." I didn't hear a warning in those words. I heard commitment. The request itself didn't sound dramatic. He asked if I would step back from my work for a bit, reduce my client load, and help support what he was building. Not forever, just until things stabilized. He spoke about long-term security, about how families made sacrifices for each other. He never raised his voice. He never pressured me. He simply waited. I hesitated, but only briefly. I had worked hard to build my independence. But I believed independence didn't disappear just because you chose partnership. I told myself this was an investment, not a loss. A pause, not an ending. So I agreed. What I gave up wasn't just income. It was visibility. It was momentum. I went from making decisions every day to waiting for updates. My calendar emptied in ways that felt strange at first, then quietly permanent. I told myself I would return to my work once things settled. I told myself I was choosing love over ego. Daniel's family responded immediately and positively. His mother thanked me for being supportive. His sister told me how rare it was to find someone who didn't compete with her husband. They spoke as if I had passed a test I hadn't known I was taking. I felt appreciated. That mattered more to me than I realized. Soon after, there were documents. Nothing alarming, nothing dramatic. Just routine paperwork, Daniel said, to simplify things while he handled the business side of our lives. He explained what I needed to know and summarized the rest. He was careful to make it sound efficient, not dismissive. "You trust me, right?" he asked lightly, sliding the papers toward me. I did. I signed where he pointed. I didn't keep copies. I didn't ask for time. I didn't notice the way the language framed authority and responsibility in ways that subtly excluded me. I trusted that marriage meant protection. After that, things shifted faster. Conversations I used to be part of happened without me. Decisions were made before I even knew there was something to decide. When I asked questions, Daniel answered kindly but vaguely. "It's handled," he'd say. "You don't need to worry about it." At family gatherings, I noticed how often people spoke about plans as if I weren't in the room. When I contributed, my comments were acknowledged politely, then bypassed. No one was rude. No one argued with me. That was what made it confusing. I was thanked more often than I was consulted. Once during dinner, Daniel's father joked that I was too generous for my own good. Everyone laughed. No one disagreed. I smiled along, even though something about it didn't sit right. I began to realize that my sacrifice had changed how I was seen. I wasn't a partner anymore. I was a support role. Valuable, yes. Necessary sometimes. But interchangeable. The most unsettling part was how normal it all felt. There was no moment where alarms went off, no argument that made me stop and reevaluate. It was a gradual erosion, happening quietly under the cover of good intentions and family unity. One evening, I overheard Daniel on the phone in the other room. He was explaining a decision to someone, speaking confidently, as if there were no debate. He said, "We agreed this was the best way forward." We hadn't. I stood there, listening, my heart racing not with anger but with recognition. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a pattern. When I mentioned it later, carefully, he brushed it off. He said I was reading too much into things, that I'd been under stress, that everything was for our benefit. His tone was gentle enough to make me doubt myself. I stopped pushing. That night, lying awake, I understood something I hadn't been ready to see before. The moment I stepped out of my own power, I became easier to move, easier to redefine, easier to replace. What I had given up hadn't made me safer. It had made me invisible. I didn't know it yet, but this was the moment they would return to later. This decision, entered willingly and with love, would become the foundation they used to argue that I had never truly belonged where decisions were made. And once I stepped back, they didn't just move forward without me. They began deciding who I was allowed to be. Nothing dramatic happened at first. There was no argument, no announcement, no single moment I could point to and say, "This is when it changed." Life continued on the surface exactly as it always had. We ate dinner together. We attended family gatherings. We made small talk about ordinary things. And yet, something essential had shifted, quietly and deliberately, just beneath the routine. I began to notice that I was always the last to know. Plans would already be settled by the time they reached me. Decisions affecting our schedule, our finances, even our future were presented as facts, not questions. "We've already taken care of it," Daniel would say, almost kindly. "There's no need for you to worry." At first, I told myself this was efficiency. I had stepped back, after all. This was what support looked like. But the feeling that followed wasn't relief. It was disorientation. I felt like I was walking into rooms where conversations had already ended. Family dinners became especially revealing. People spoke in shorthand, referencing discussions I hadn't been part of. When I asked for clarification, someone would fill me in quickly, vaguely, then move on. No one lingered on my questions long enough for them to matter. I started to hear phrases that felt rehearsed. "This makes the most sense." "It's already been decided." "There's no reason to complicate things." Each sentence shut a door gently, without force, without leaving a mark. The first time I tried to push back, I did it carefully. I chose my words with intention, my tone calm. I told Daniel that I felt out of the loop, that I wanted to be included in decisions that affected both of us. He listened, nodding, then sighed in a way that made me feel unreasonable for speaking at all. "You're overthinking this," he said. "You've been under a lot of stress. Let me handle things for now." Later that same week, his sister repeated the exact phrase to me, almost word for word. That was the moment something cold settled in my chest. It wasn't just Daniel. This language was traveling. It was being shared. From then on, every reaction I had was quietly documented. If I asked questions, I was anxious. If I expressed frustration, I was emotional. If I stayed quiet, I was finally being reasonable. No response worked in my favor. I began censoring myself before I spoke. I replayed conversations in my head afterward, wondering how my words might be used later. I started choosing silence not because I agreed, but because disagreement only seemed to confirm a version of me I didn't recognize. The humiliations were small, but they accumulated. Jokes about my phase, comments about how I used to be more relaxed, praises that felt like warnings. In public, I was described as supportive and patient. In private, my influence vanished. One afternoon, I walked into a room and the conversation stopped mid-sentence. It resumed a moment later, carefully rerouted, but the damage was done. I had never felt so present and so invisible at the same time. The moment I couldn't ignore came sooner than I expected. A decision was made that directly affected my future, one that should have involved my consent at the very least. I found out after it had already been set in motion. When I confronted Daniel, gently but firmly, he looked genuinely surprised, not defensive, not guilty, confused. As if the idea that I might object hadn't occurred to him at all. "We thought this was best," he said. "Everyone agrees." Everyone didn't include me. I felt something in me harden then, not into anger but into clarity. This wasn't miscommunication. It wasn't stress. It wasn't love expressed imperfectly. It was structure. A system that had learned it could move without me. What frightened me most was how smoothly it worked. No raised voices. No ultimatums. Just momentum that carried on as if my presence was optional. That night, lying awake beside Daniel, I realized that I wasn't being pushed out violently. I was being edged out politely. Being ignored was easier for them than confronting me and far more effective. I thought back to the early days, to the praise for being adaptable, for not making things difficult. I understood now what those compliments had been training me for. The disappearance didn't feel like betrayal at first. It felt like erasure. And then, just as I was coming to terms with that realization, something else entered the picture. Not as a shock, but as confirmation. A presence that made everything click into place and proved that what I was experiencing wasn't temporary or accidental, it was planned. I didn't discover the other woman the way people expect. There was no dramatic confrontation, no lipstick on a collar, no frantic confession. What unsettled me most was how easy it was, how careless. It was as if secrecy had stopped being necessary long before I noticed. The first hint came through a schedule change Daniel mentioned casually, something about a recurring obligation that didn't quite make sense. Then a name surfaced once, twice, always in passing. When I finally saw her, it wasn't by accident. It was almost as if I had been allowed to. She was standing beside him at a small gathering, close enough to touch, familiar enough to belong. Her posture was relaxed, her expression open. She didn't look like someone hiding. She looked like someone who had already been introduced. I waited for embarrassment, for guilt to flash across her face when she noticed me. It didn't. Instead, she smiled politely, as if we were being presented to each other under ordinary circumstances. That was when the confusion hit. This wasn't a secret affair. This was a transition. What struck me most was how much she seemed to know. She referenced things about my life casually, details I hadn't shared publicly. She spoke as if she had been briefed, as if my existence had been summarized for her in advance. Later, when I finally said the word out loud, when I asked Daniel to explain, he didn't deny it. He sighed, tired, as if we were discussing an inconvenience rather than a betrayal. He spoke about connection, about drifting apart, about how complicated things had become. What he didn't speak about was shame. The conversation that followed wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, it was disturbingly reasonable. He framed everything as inevitable, as if this outcome had been forming naturally, without intention. He spoke as though I had missed a meeting where the decision had already been made. When his family learned I knew, their response told me more than his words ever could. There was no outrage, no surprise, just a brief, awkward pause before they shifted into reassurance mode. "These things happen," his mother said gently, as if she were offering comfort rather than dismissing a betrayal. His sister added, "You don't know the whole picture," with the kind of certainty that suggested she believed she did. No one asked how I felt. No one questioned the situation itself. The focus was on managing my reaction, not addressing what had been done. That was when I understood something fundamental. I wasn't reacting late. I was reacting alone. The narrative shifted quickly after that. Conversations began circling back to me, not as a partner, but as a problem. The distance in our marriage was framed as my doing. My sacrifices were recast as interference. My discomfort was labeled instability. The same phrases appeared again and again, spoken by different people in different settings. I was too sensitive. I was struggling. I needed time to adjust. It was as if they had agreed on the language beforehand. For a brief, disorienting period, I questioned myself. I replayed memories, wondering if I had missed signs, misunderstood signals, exaggerated my own importance. Gaslighting doesn't feel like manipulation when it's delivered calmly by people you once trusted. Then something shifted. It happened quietly, during a moment I hadn't expected to matter. I watched the way Daniel and his family spoke to the other woman, the ease with which she was folded into conversations, plans, assumptions. She wasn't being hidden from me. She was being installed in my place. And suddenly I stopped blaming her. She hadn't dismantled my marriage. She had stepped into a structure that had already been cleared, a role that had already been prepared. The affair wasn't the rupture. It was the reveal. Once I saw that, everything else fell into place. The decisions made without me, the language used to minimize my role, the way my reactions were documented and shared. This wasn't about desire or romance. It was about control and continuity. I began paying attention differently after that. I stopped watching her and started watching them. The family meetings that no longer included me. The future plans discussed openly in front of her. The way my name was mentioned less and less, as if removing it from conversations would make my absence official. I realized then that by the time I learned about her, they had already moved on, not emotionally, strategically. I was expected to accept it quietly, to step aside gracefully, to preserve the image of a family that took care of its own. I was meant to leave with dignity, grateful for whatever scraps of consideration they chose to offer. What they didn't realize was that the moment I stopped focusing on the affair, I started seeing the larger plan forming around it. The affair wasn't the end of my marriage. It was the justification they needed to finish what they had already started. By the time the other woman entered my life, the exit had already been mapped. And that was when I started paying attention to what they were preparing. Not for me, but without me. The moment everything finally aligned in my mind, it didn't come with panic. It came with a strange, chilling clarity. Pieces that had felt disconnected suddenly formed a pattern I couldn't unsee. The affair, the exclusion, the careful language, the rehearsed concern. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography. I realized then that I wasn't being pushed out because things had gone wrong. I was being transitioned out because things were going exactly as planned. The first signs were subtle, disguised as responsibility. Conversations shifted toward options and advice. Daniel began mentioning that he had spoken to professionals, that certain steps were being taken to protect everyone involved. The words were vague, but the intent was not. This wasn't about saving a marriage. It was about minimizing disruption. I started hearing legal language where it didn't belong, phrases that sounded borrowed, not natural. Long-term implications, best interests, clean outcomes. They crept into conversations that used to be personal, turning intimate discussions into strategy sessions I was never invited to attend. Responsibilities I once shared were reassigned quietly. Authority moved hands without ceremony. I wasn't told I had lost influence. I was simply no longer asked to exercise it. Whenever I hesitated, whenever I tried to slow things down or ask for clarity, I was met with the same calm response. "There's no need to get upset." This doesn't have to be difficult. We're trying to make this easier for you. Easier meant quieter. Easier meant compliant. Then came the concern. Concern wrapped in kindness. Concern delivered with practiced sincerity. Daniel mentioned that people were worried about me. His sister asked if I was sleeping enough. His mother suggested I might benefit from stepping away from stress for a while. Each comment landed gently, but together they formed something far more dangerous. They were building a version of me that couldn't be trusted with decisions. Stories about my reactions began circulating, subtly altered with each retelling. Moments of frustration became emotional instability. Questions became resistance. Silence became proof that I was overwhelmed. I heard my own words reflected back to me, reshaped into something unrecognizable. The most unsettling part was how coordinated it felt. Different people, same language. Different settings, same conclusions. They weren't just agreeing with each other, they were reinforcing a narrative. I understood then that this was the real plan. Not just to leave me, but to discredit me gently enough that no one would question the outcome. I was meant to exit quietly, framed as fragile rather than wronged, spared confrontation but stripped of authority. Compliance had its rewards. When I didn't push back, access returned. I was included again, loosely, just enough to observe. When I stayed agreeable, the tone softened. Politeness resurfaced. It was conditional kindness, offered only as long as I didn't interfere. Someone said, almost kindly, that fighting would only make things worse for me, that resistance would complicate matters, that I should think carefully about how I wanted to be remembered. That was when fear finally gave way to resolve. Because buried beneath their careful planning, I noticed something they had missed. A detail so small it blended into routine. A contradiction in timing, a procedural assumption made too confidently. They believed I wouldn't notice because they believed I didn't understand how power actually worked. They were wrong. I stopped asking why they were doing this and started asking how. I paid attention to the order of events, to what had been set in motion and what hadn't. I noticed what required my consent and what had proceeded without it. I noticed where certainty was real and where it was manufactured. Most importantly, I noticed what they assumed about me. That I was emotional, not analytical, that I trusted blindly, that my silence meant confusion, not calculation. Once I saw that, everything changed. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't accuse. I didn't defend myself. I let them believe the plan was working exactly as intended. I allowed their confidence to grow, their caution to fade. I let them underestimate me in the very ways that made their strategy fragile. Hope was no longer useful to me. I stopped hoping for fairness or understanding. What replaced it was far steadier. Preparation. I began documenting things quietly, not dramatically. Dates, shifts in language, decisions that contradicted previous statements. I didn't need proof of betrayal. I needed proof of process. By the time Daniel mentioned the upcoming hearing as if it were a formality, I understood what it really was. Not a resolution, but a checkpoint. A moment they intended to use to formalize my removal. They believed the hardest part was already behind them, that the emotional work had been done, that all that remained was paperwork and patience. They mistook my stillness for resignation. What they couldn't see was that every time they reassured themselves, every time they spoke freely around me, they revealed more than they realized. Their plan depended on my reactions staying predictable, calm enough to manage, weak enough to override. Instead, I was watching. By the time I chose silence fully, not as avoidance but as strategy, I understood something essential. Power doesn't announce itself when it's most effective. It waits. And so did I. Instead of confronting them, I stepped back and let the illusion hold. I let them believe they were in control. I let them continue exactly as they were. Because once you understand the structure of a plan, you don't need to stop it immediately. You just need to be there when it collapses. I remember the exact moment I decided to stop reacting. It wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no final insult that pushed me over the edge. It happened quietly, in the middle of an ordinary conversation, when I realized that every response I gave was being collected, categorized, and used against me. In that instant, something clicked. I understood that my emotions were no longer mine alone. They were tools in someone else's plan, so I took them away. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped correcting false assumptions. I stopped asking questions that were never meant to be answered honestly. Instead, I nodded. I listened. I agreed just enough to keep doors open. The change was immediate. Daniel relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. His shoulders loosened. His voice softened. He started speaking around me instead of at me, as if the threat of resistance had finally passed. His family followed his lead. The tension I had felt walking into rooms eased, replaced by something almost pleasant. They thought I had accepted my role. When I stayed quiet, they became generous with their words again. When I didn't challenge decisions, they included me loosely, casually, as if nothing had ever been wrong. Someone even thanked me for finally being reasonable, and I smiled politely while noting how revealing that sentence was. Compliance bought me access. I began paying attention to everything I had missed while I was busy defending myself. Who spoke to whom before decisions were announced? When certain conversations happened, and who was deliberately excluded? Which documents appeared on the kitchen counter, and how quickly they disappeared once they'd served their purpose? I stopped listening to what they said, and started watching what they did. Patterns emerged once emotion was removed from the equation. Daniel always made certain calls before family dinners. His sister framed concerns as observations, never accusations. His mother asked questions that sounded caring but were designed to extract information. It was a system, polished and efficient, built on the assumption that I wouldn't notice. They underestimated me in a very specific way. They assumed my silence meant confusion. They assumed patience meant passivity. They had no idea how closely I was watching. It was during one of these quieter periods that an unexpected ally appeared. Not someone dramatic or heroic, just someone observant, a professional acquaintance who had known us both for years, who had no emotional stake in our marriage. Over coffee, they mentioned something casually, a small inconsistency they had noticed in the way Daniel described recent events. "I might be wrong," they said carefully, "but that timeline doesn't quite add up." That single sentence did more for me than any confrontation ever could have. It confirmed that what I was seeing wasn't imagined. I didn't elaborate, I didn't ask for opinions, I simply listened. Later, in a separate conversation, the same person mentioned they had seen similar situations before. Family-led separations, quiet removals, clean narratives built around emotional instability rather than accountability. They didn't offer advice, they didn't warn me. They just shared the observation. That was enough. Not long after, I found the first piece of real leverage. It wasn't hidden behind a lock or guarded fiercely. It was sitting in plain sight, overlooked because it was assumed I wouldn't understand its significance. A document referenced in conversation, but never explained. A procedural detail mentioned once and never revisited. I didn't react when I found it. I didn't bring it up. I made a mental note and moved on, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. I realized then where their plan was vulnerable. Not emotionally, structurally. They had built their strategy on assumptions about my behavior, my capacity, my willingness to accept what I was given. They had accounted for anger, denial, bargaining. They had not planned for patience. Timing mattered more than truth now. Confronting them too early would only tighten their defenses. Revealing what I knew before it mattered would give them time to adjust. Power, I was learning, wasn't about what you uncovered. It was about when you chose to let it be seen. So, I waited. I played the role they assigned me flawlessly. I asked fewer questions. I expressed understanding. I kept my tone even and my reactions small. They grew comfortable again, confident that the difficult part was over. They began speaking more freely around me. discussing next steps without lowering their voices, referencing future arrangements as if they were already finalized. Every word confirmed that they believed the narrative was set. What they didn't realize was that my silence had given me space. Space to observe, space to prepare, space to build something quietly while they focused on managing appearances. By the time Daniel mentioned the upcoming hearing as a routine step, I saw it clearly for what it was. Not a threat, but an opportunity. A moment where structure mattered more than story, where authority would override assumption. They believed the hearing would formalize what they had already decided. They believed I would arrive unprepared, reactive, emotional. They believed the hardest part was behind them. That belief was their greatest mistake. As I sat alone one evening, reviewing everything I had noticed, everything I had learned by saying nothing at all, I felt something close to calm settle over me. Not hope, not anger, certainty. I wasn't defending myself anymore. I was preparing to let their own confidence do the work for me. I was building something they never thought to look for because it didn't fit the version of me they had created. They thought I had gone quiet because I was losing. In reality, I had simply stopped reacting and started choosing when the story would change. Silence gave me something I hadn't had in months: access. Once I stopped reacting, people stopped guarding their words around me. Conversations unfolded in my presence again, unfiltered, careless. I became background noise to them, the quiet figure they no longer considered a variable. And when people believe you're finished, they stop hiding what matters. I noticed it first at the kitchen counter, where documents appeared briefly before being gathered away. Not dramatic files stamped with warnings, just ordinary paperwork discussed as if it were administrative clutter. I listened without comment, my attention fixed on timing, not content. Who mentioned what and when, who assumed what was already settled? It was there that the subplot finally revealed itself. Not as a secret locked away, but as a structure that predated me. An arrangement that governed decisions long before the affair and quietly dictated everything after it. It explained why my objections were dismissed, why my consent became optional. My role had been temporary in a system designed to look permanent. I saw my name referenced once in passing, not as a decision maker, but as a condition. Something to be managed, something assumed. The casualness of it chilled me more than any argument ever could. This wasn't personal, it was procedural. I didn't rush to conclusions. I tested the pattern. I waited. Over the next weeks, conversations confirmed what I suspected. References to timelines that didn't align with what I'd been told. Decisions framed as already compliant with expectations I had never agreed to. Each piece reinforced the same truth. I was collateral in a plan that required my silence to function. When I finally confirmed it with the outside ally who had quietly validated my concerns, they didn't dramatize it. They didn't tell me to be angry or afraid. They explained the implications plainly, the way professionals do when they're careful with words. If this comes out, they said, it doesn't just affect your situation. It changes how a lot of people are viewed. That was the moment I understood the scope. This leverage reached beyond my marriage. It touched reputations, assumptions, safeguards people relied on without question. It wasn't explosive. It was destabilizing. They warned me gently that once used, it couldn't be taken back. That exposure wasn't a tool you wielded twice. I thanked them and said nothing more. I didn't need encouragement. I needed clarity. What struck me most was how certain everyone had been that I would never find this. They assumed complexity would protect them, that trust would keep me from verifying, that my role as the supportive wife meant I wouldn't look too closely at systems built around me. They underestimated me because they built their confidence on who they thought I was. I chose not to strike then. Not because I was unsure, but because timing mattered more than truth. Revealing what I knew too early would have allowed them to adjust, to reinforce weak points, to recast the narrative. I wasn't interested in confrontation. I was interested in finality. So I gathered quietly. Copies where copies mattered. Notes where memory could be challenged. Confirmation where assumptions were strong. I didn't change my behavior. I didn't become colder or sharper. I remained agreeable, observant, unthreatening. The hearing date took on a different meaning after that. What had once loomed like a threat now felt like an anchor point, a place where structure would override story, where authority would demand consistency instead of charm. I watched Daniel speak more confidently as the date approached. He referenced the hearing as a formality, a necessary step to formalize arrangements already decided. His family echoed the sentiment. They were relaxed now, satisfied that the difficult emotional work had been completed. They believed the rest was paperwork. What they didn't see was how exposed that belief made them. They assumed I was preparing emotionally for loss, not preparing structurally for truth. They mistook my calm for resignation, my cooperation for acceptance. One evening, as I reviewed everything I had gathered, I felt no rush of triumph, no hunger for revenge. What I felt was steadiness, the kind that comes when uncertainty dissolves into alignment. I wasn't defending myself anymore. I wasn't trying to be heard within their system. I was preparing to step outside it and let something larger take over. The power I held didn't come from what I knew alone. It came from when I chose to let it matter. I understood now that authority didn't need my voice raised to work. It needed my patience. By the time I went to sleep that night, the path ahead was clear. I knew exactly where the information belonged. I knew who needed to see it. And I knew when, not now, soon enough. For the first time since everything began to unravel, I felt anchored instead of adrift. Not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because I was no longer guessing. I wasn't hoping for fairness. I was preparing for a moment when fairness would be required. And when that moment came, I would already be there, silent and ready, letting the truth do what emotion never could. The morning of the hearing arrived without drama, no racing heart, no sleepless panic. I woke before my alarm, steady and clear, as if my body already knew this day was no longer something to fear. I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to disappear. Neutral colors, clean lines, nothing that asked for attention. Walking into the courthouse, I noticed how familiar the building felt, even though I had never been there before. The cold air, the echo of footsteps, the low murmur of voices waiting their turn. Months ago, this place would have overwhelmed me. Now it felt procedural, like a checkpoint rather than a battlefield. I saw them before they saw me. Daniel stood near the entrance with his attorney, posture relaxed, confidence unforced. He looked like someone who expected cooperation, not resistance. The woman beside him, the one who had quietly replaced me in every plan that mattered, adjusted her coat and glanced around as if she belonged there. Behind them, members of his family clustered together, unified and calm, their expressions rehearsed into polite concern. They didn't look anxious. That told me everything. When Daniel noticed me, he gave a small nod. Not hostile, not apologetic. Final. It was the nod of someone who believed the outcome was already settled. His family followed his gaze, assessing me quickly, as if checking whether I looked fragile enough to justify the story they had prepared. I offered nothing. No reaction. No tension. Just stillness. Inside the courtroom, the seating made the imbalance visible. I sat alone at my table, my space quiet and uncluttered. Across the aisle, Daniel's side filled the bench behind him. It looked intentional, like a visual reminder of support and solidarity. To anyone watching, I must have appeared isolated. I let that assumption stand. As people settled in, I became acutely aware of how often eyes flicked toward me, curious, expectant. They were waiting for something, tears, anger, a breakdown. I gave them none of it. I focused on breathing evenly, on staying present. The judge entered, and the room rose and fell in unison. Formalities followed, the rhythm familiar even if the experience wasn't. When Daniel's attorney began speaking, his tone was smooth, confident, practiced. He framed the situation as orderly and reasonable, emphasizing stability, cooperation, and clean resolutions. I listened without flinching. They spoke about me as if I weren't there, as if my role in the situation was secondary, already defined. The narrative was simple. I was emotional, overwhelmed, resistant to change. They presented their version of events as inevitable, not contested. Daniel didn't look at me once while they spoke. He didn't need to. In his mind, this was a formality. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't rush, I didn't interrupt. I waited, hands folded, posture neutral. The restraint seemed to confuse them more than any argument would have. The woman beside Daniel shifted slightly, her earlier confidence flickering for just a moment. I could feel it then. The quiet discomfort that settles in when someone doesn't behave the way you planned for. The judge asked a few questions, neutral and measured. Clarifications, context, nothing dramatic. Still, the rhythm of the room changed. The attorney hesitated before answering one question, then smoothed it over quickly. Daniel glanced at him, a subtle tightening around his eyes. I stayed silent. When the judge asked for a specific document, there was a pause. Not long, but long enough. Papers were passed forward. The file I had been waiting for moved from one hand to another and finally onto the bench. The judge opened it. He didn't speak. He read. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, pressing against the room. I watched his eyes move steadily across the page, then another. He paused once, then again, lingering on a section longer than the rest. Daniel shifted in his seat. The woman beside him leaned forward slightly, her confidence draining into confusion. One of his family members whispered something under their breath, the sound sharp in the quiet. I didn't look at them. I watched the judge. For months I had imagined this moment, not in triumph, but in clarity. I had pictured the exact point where assumption met structure, where confidence met authority. This was it. The judge adjusted his glasses and turned another page. The courtroom felt suspended, as if everyone was holding the same breath without realizing it. This was the moment they stopped smiling. Not because they understood everything yet, but because they realized something had shifted. The story they brought into the room was no longer the only one being considered. Control was moving out of their hands. I felt no surge of satisfaction, no rush of victory. What I felt was grounding, the kind that comes when anticipation gives way to inevitability. They had walked into this room expecting confirmation, a clean continuation of a plan already in motion. They believed I would react emotionally, defend myself poorly, reinforce the narrative they had spent months constructing. Instead, I had waited. As the judge continued reading, the confidence on Daniel's face faded into something tighter, more uncertain. The woman beside him looked at him now, searching for reassurance he didn't give. His family leaned closer together, the unity they had relied on suddenly fragile. I stayed exactly where I was, silent, still, ready. Because everything that mattered now was no longer in the hands of people who underestimated me. It was in the hands of someone who didn't know our history, didn't care about family loyalty, and had no interest in managing emotions. Only facts. And as the judge reached the end of the file, I knew this hearing was no longer about removing me quietly. It was about listening. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument I had imagined. The judge continued reading, page after page, without a single comment. No raised eyebrow, no frown. Just a steady, methodical pace that drained the confidence from the room 1 second at a time. I could feel the shift before anyone acknowledged it. Daniel sat straighter in his chair, the relaxed ease he'd carried into the courtroom replaced by something rigid. His attorney leaned closer to the bench, eyes flicking back and forth as if trying to anticipate what question might come next. The woman beside Daniel no longer smiled. She studied the judge's face with open confusion, as though waiting for a cue that never came. The judge paused on one page longer than the others. He adjusted his glasses and looked up briefly, Not at me, but at Daniel's attorney. "I need clarification on this section," he said evenly, "before we proceed." The attorney stood, voice smooth but a shade tighter than before. He offered an explanation that sounded practiced, confident, rehearsed for a room that no longer existed. As he spoke, the judge's expression didn't change. When the attorney finished, the judge nodded once and turned back to the file. "That explanation," he said calmly, "raises additional questions." A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. Daniel's foot shifted against the floor. His sister leaned forward, her earlier certainty gone. I stayed exactly where I was, hands folded, eyes steady. The judge's tone remained neutral, almost detached, but the effect was unmistakable. Control was leaving the narrative they had brought with them. This was no longer a performance. It was an examination. "I want to be clear," the judge continued, "that the matter before this court is not limited to what has been characterized as a personal dispute." He glanced down at the file again. "There are inconsistencies here that extend beyond that scope." For the first time, Daniel looked directly at me. Not with anger, not with dismissal. With something closer to calculation, as if trying to determine what I knew and when I had known it. I met his gaze briefly, then looked back to the judge. The judge asked for additional documentation, not aggressively, not accusatorily, simply as a matter of process. The attorney hesitated for half a second too long before responding. That hesitation landed louder than any objection. The woman beside Daniel turned toward him, her voice low but urgent. He didn't answer her. His attention was fixed on the bench now, where the judge had begun outlining next steps with careful precision. "This court will require further review," the judge said. "Until that review is complete, certain assumptions presented today cannot be relied upon." The word assumptions hung in the air. The judge issued preliminary directives, not dramatic but firm. Boundaries were established, limitations clarified. The casual certainty that had carried Daniel into the room was replaced by restraint imposed from outside his control. No one interrupted, no one smiled. The judge leaned back slightly, hands resting on the bench. "I want to remind all parties," he said, "that this process exists to ensure clarity, not convenience." Daniel's attorney nodded quickly. His family exchanged glances that no longer looked coordinated. The woman beside him stared straight ahead, her confidence fully dissolved into silence. I felt no urge to speak. What mattered was no longer what I said or didn't say. Authority had taken over the narrative, and authority doesn't need emotional reinforcement to do its work. The judge looked down once more, then back up. "This hearing will be adjourned pending further review," he said. "The matters raised today warrant careful consideration." He brought the gavel down, not sharply, but decisively. Court was over. As people stood and began gathering their things, the room buzzed with a low murmur that hadn't existed before. Not celebration, not outrage, uncertainty, the kind that follows when a plan encounters something it can't easily correct. Daniel remained seated for a moment, his jaw tight, eyes unfocused. His attorney leaned in to speak quietly. His sister whispered something sharp under her breath. The woman who had once sat so confidently beside him now stood slightly apart, her earlier sense of belonging gone. I stayed seated until the judge left the room. Then I stood. As I walked past them, Daniel turned toward me. "We need to talk," he said under his breath. I paused, just long enough to meet his eyes. "There's nothing left to explain," I replied quietly. For the first time since this had begun, he didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He didn't dismiss me. He watched as I walked away, understanding finally that the story he had prepared no longer belonged to him. They had entered that courtroom expecting a conclusion, a clean affirmation of decisions already made. What they received instead was exposure to a process they couldn't control. As I stepped into the hallway, the noise of the courtroom faded behind me. I felt no rush of triumph, no desire to look back. What I felt was finality. The judge hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't accused or condemned. He had simply spoken. And with that, everything they believed about their position in this story began to collapse. The moment the judge left the room, the atmosphere changed completely. The quiet confidence that had filled the courtroom earlier evaporated, replaced by hurried movements and low, urgent voices. Chairs scraped against the floor, papers were gathered too quickly, hands no longer steady. No one looked at me. That alone told me how much had shifted. Daniel stood up slowly, his expression controlled but tight, like someone recalculating under pressure. His attorney leaned in close, speaking in a hushed tone that carried none of the certainty from moments earlier. The words were clipped now, reactive, damage control instead of strategy. Behind them, the family unity I had grown accustomed to watching began to fracture. His sister whispered sharply, her composure cracked by irritation. His mother looked unsettled, glancing between Daniel and the attorney as if waiting for reassurance that didn't come. They were no longer a single front. They were individuals, each calculating their own exposure. The woman who had once sat beside Daniel with quiet confidence now hovered a step away. She adjusted her bag, her posture stiff, eyes darting between faces for cues that no one offered her. Whatever future she thought had been secured in that room was no longer guaranteed. I stayed where I was for a moment, letting the noise settle around me. Silence had carried me this far. I wasn't about to abandon it now. When I finally stood, Daniel turned toward me. "We should talk," he said quietly, the authority drained from his voice. It wasn't a command. It was a test, a last attempt to see if the old dynamic still applied. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something I hadn't seen before. Uncertainty. Not fear yet, but awareness. The realization that he no longer controlled the pace or the narrative. "There's nothing to discuss right now," I said calmly. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, he didn't know what response would work. In the hallway outside the courtroom, conversations broke into smaller, more frantic clusters. The attorney spoke into his phone, tone low and urgent. Daniel's sister paced a few steps away, her earlier confidence replaced by visible frustration. His mother stood still, eyes fixed on the floor, her expression caught somewhere between concern and calculation. No one approached me. That absence felt deliberate now. Where once they would have managed me, guided me, softened the edges of my reaction, they now seemed unsure how to engage at all. I was no longer predictable. That made me inconvenient. Daniel tried again as we walked toward the exit. "This isn't over," he said, not threatening but strained. "There are next steps." "I know," I replied. "That's the point." He stopped walking. I didn't. Behind me I heard the woman who had replaced me ask a question, her voice tight with unease. "What does this mean?" No one answered her. That was when I understood the full cost of what had just happened. Not in penalties or consequences, not yet, but in the collapse of certainty. The structure they relied on had cracked, and everyone could feel it. Outside the building, the air felt sharper, cleaner. People dispersed quickly, each heading in different directions. The unity that had once pressed me into silence dissolved as soon as authority left the room. Daniel lingered near the steps, phone pressed to his ear, posture rigid. His attorney paced nearby, flipping through notes, already preparing arguments for a future that now looked far less controlled. His family stood apart, their quiet whispers carrying tension instead of coordination. I walked past them all without slowing. For months, I had imagined what this moment might feel like. I had expected satisfaction, maybe even vindication. What I felt instead was something steadier and far more valuable. Separation, not just from the marriage, but from the system that had tried to erase me. Later that afternoon, messages began to arrive. Short, careful texts, requests to clarify, suggestions that we should handle this privately. The tone had shifted completely. Where there had once been dismissal, there was now caution. I didn't respond. The court didn't need my commentary to keep moving. Authority had already begun its work. Procedures were set in motion, timelines adjusted. The narrative was no longer being shaped by family loyalty or quiet manipulation. It was being examined. That evening, sitting alone in my apartment, I replayed the day not with emotion, but with distance. The hearing hadn't delivered punishment. It hadn't delivered closure. What it had delivered was interruption. A break in momentum that forced everyone involved to stop and reassess. That mattered more than any dramatic outcome. I realized then that the hardest part hadn't been standing up for myself. It had been waiting long enough to let the right moment do the work. Watching power unravel isn't loud, it's uncomfortable. It's watching people realize they no longer control the story they were so confident in. By the end of the day, I understood that what had shifted wasn't just the direction of the case. It was my position within it. I was no longer reacting to events as they happened. I was moving forward on my own terms, no longer defined by their expectations. I went to sleep that night knowing the outcome was no longer about winning or losing. It was about separation, about stepping out of a structure that had relied on my silence and continuing without it. I had walked into that building believing the hearing would decide my future. I walked out knowing something far more important had already been decided. I was done being managed. I walked out of the courthouse alone, not because I had no one waiting for me, but because I needed the quiet. The doors closed behind me with a soft, final sound, and for the first time in a long while, nothing was being decided for me. No one was watching my reaction, no one was measuring my tone. The noise had faded, and what remained was stillness. I expected to feel lighter, victorious maybe. Instead, I felt settled, as if something heavy had been set down gently rather than dropped. The fight hadn't ended in a dramatic explosion. It had resolved, the way things do when truth finally interrupts momentum. What I had won wasn't something that could be listed or tallied. It wasn't about who lost more or who would pay later. What I had won was my name, intact and unaltered. My voice, no longer filtered through someone else's version of me. My future, no longer negotiated in rooms I wasn't invited into. For months, I had been treated like a problem to be managed, an inconvenience to be softened, redirected, quietly removed. That ended the moment authority stopped listening to the story they were telling and started reading what they had overlooked. I thought briefly of Daniel, of how certain he had been. Certainty, I learned, is fragile when it's built on assumptions instead of facts. I thought of his family, so unified when they believed control was guaranteed, so scattered once it wasn't. And I thought of the woman who had stepped into my life believing stability had already been secured for her. None of them were villains in the way stories like this often require. They were people who trusted a system that had always worked for them. A system that only failed once someone it underestimated stopped playing along. That realization mattered more to me than any consequence that might follow. In the days that came after, the world didn't change overnight. There were still conversations to be had, processes to follow, decisions yet to be made. But the difference was unmistakable. I was no longer reacting. I was choosing. I noticed it in small things first, the way I spoke without rehearsing my words, the way I didn't feel the need to justify my boundaries, the way silence felt like peace instead of punishment. I learned that staying calm doesn't mean staying small, that patience, when chosen deliberately, can be sharper than confrontation. That people who underestimate you often build their entire strategy on that belief, never considering what happens if they're wrong. For a long time, I had mistaken belonging for safety. I had believed that being agreeable meant being protected. I understand now that real safety comes from knowing exactly where you stand, even if that place is alone. If you've ever been dismissed quietly, edged out politely, or made to feel like your voice mattered less because it was inconvenient, I want you to know something. You're not imagining it. And you're not powerless, even when it feels that way. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided who you are. Sometimes the shift doesn't come when you raise your voice, but when you let the right authority speak instead. This story didn't end with applause or celebration. It ended with clarity, with the understanding that I didn't need to be loud to be heard, and I didn't need to be chosen to be whole. As I drove away from the courthouse that day, I didn't look back. Not because I was running from anything, but because there was nothing left there that belonged to me. The chapter had closed, not with anger, but with resolve. If any part of this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated in a moment that mattered? Have you ever stayed quiet long enough for the truth to speak for itself? Your experiences matter, and sharing them might help someone else feel less alone. This channel exists to tell stories like this. Stories about justice that doesn't shout, strength that doesn't beg, and moments where the tables turn not through revenge, but through clarity. If you want to hear more stories like mine, I hope you'll stay with us, subscribe, and be part of this space. Because sometimes the most powerful moment isn't when you finally speak, it's when the truth does.